Welcome everyone to the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. This is the fifth session and the last installment of Art Gottlieb's of the Cold War, A Historical Perspective. I would like to take a moment to thank the Friends of the Library for sponsoring for this program. Now please give a warm welcome to Art Gottlieb.
Thank you. And welcome. This was a 5-part series, so this is the last one today. So thank you for joining me. I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed doing it. Now, today, we're going to be talking about the end of the Cold War in its traditional term, that is against the Soviet Union specifically, right? Whether or not we're in a Cold War today with another communist power is, as I pointed out in my syllabus here, right? For today's program, you know, that's going to have to be a subject for another discussion. It's certainly a speculative thing today, and I wonder if people who are, obviously I'm talking about China specifically, and I wonder if you're, I don't know, if you were born after, say, for instance, the fall of the Berlin Wall, would you know, even have a point of comparison in your own life of understanding of saying, well, is this like Cold War that we're in today as it was with the Soviet Union? And then another question would be, well, what nature has Vladimir Putin's behavior taken? With or without the communism, it's kind of like, it's like the old Soviet Union in a sense, as far as, you know, territorial gain and this sort of, you know, this aggressiveness based on paranoia, just to use an example of my own thinking about it, that Vladimir Putin has. It reminds me of Stalin. So, you know, another question would be on the world stage today is, do you have kind of like a Cold War with Russia without the communism, you see, you know? So I'm going to use for the first time during this series a PowerPoint presentation, because I think it'll illustrate clearly this period, which has my bullet points as such: Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, and then the period 1989 to 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Number 3, America as the sole superpower. Number 4, globalism and postmodern Russia. And 5, the contemporary relevance of the Cold War. Okay, and I've tried to include that last item, the contemporary relevance of the Cold War, you know, sort of lace that through our program. So anyway, here's a nice picture of Mikhail Gorbachev. And he died last year. You remember him? Very, very interesting stuff here. And of course, make a mental note of that famous birthmark on his forehead. You'll notice that in the Soviet documents I'm going to show you, like his ID card and photographs, that that birthmark has been airbrushed out. Okay, because that's part of the thing. It's if you're going to be somebody who's representing the Soviet Union, you're not allowed to have any defects, you see. So therefore, we have to airbrush that out. And here is a picture of young Mikhail Gorbachev, who was raised by his maternal grandparents. And this is a photograph taken from the 1930s, right? Interesting stuff. This is in the Ukraine, of course, which obviously is in the news these days. You know, this isn't unlike pictures of that my mother has hanging on her wall, of some of my Ukrainian ancestors from my mother's side of the family. Except, you know, they left that area because they were all being chased by by the people even before Bolshevism, because of their Jewish status. They wanted to get the hell out of there. It was like this Fiddler on the Roof type of environment, if you've ever seen that movie, and I'm sure you have. Here's a nice aerial panoramic photograph of Moscow State University, right, 1950 to 1955, where Gorbachev was a student, where he met his to-be wife, by the way, Raisa. And it's a nice building, perfectly symmetrical, etc. Now, the thing here is, in the Soviet Union, especially during these days, 1950 to 1955, all right? So if you had any aspirations to be part of the Communist Party, or you wanted to be a leader, or you even wanted to sort of like move up in the world, as we would call it, you have to be aligned with the proper ideology. You have to be aligned with the proper belief system. And to a large degree, you have to be able to pass the muster of the loyalty test, as far as that the KGB would be watching you, etc. And as it turns out, Mikhail Gorbachev was able to pass all of these tests, whether or not he was setting out to do it, or whether everyone in the Soviet Union is being watched in general. The Communist Party was always looking for people to be the new standard bearers for their cause. And of course, communism in Russia was like, literally, it's like a state religion. You weren't going anywhere unless you believed the right things and you said the right things and kept your mouth shut about anything else, assuming that you had a point of view that wasn't completely in alignment with the traditional dogma of what you were supposed to be believing and saying. But Mikhail Gorbachev was seen as an up-and-coming person, smart, youthful. I remember during my, I don't know, in the 1970s, etc., when I started becoming interested in such matters, right? I was a kid, a teenager. And I remember on the cover of Life magazine and all the rest of that, not Life magazine, but more like Time magazine, I guess. The Soviet Union had this series of leaders, which were just all these aged people, right? Chernenko, Brezhnev, right? All of these people, you see, and it was kind of like they were skimming the bottom of the barrel to find out anyone who was left from the old guard, because they had to be the standard bearers. It seemed like they how come they didn't have any youthful figures in their politics? Now, interestingly enough, I mean, I've been listening to some of the same discussion towards some of American leaders on both parties, right? Democrat and Republican parties. Why can't we find any younger people around here? Or do we have to keep, we have to like pump up these people who are in their 80s, right? And that's on both sides of the aisle. So, so from 1950 to 1955, as far as a young Mikhail Gorbachev, who would have been his role model in Soviet politics, right? Was it somebody like Stalin? No, as it turns out, it wasn't like Stalin at all. It was about Khrushchev, right? Now, if this is to understand Mikhail Gorbachev, you have to understand his influences, right? And Khrushchev was a different character completely than Stalin was, right? Stalin was the tyrant, right? The Machiavellian type of personality. I recommend that you find and read a book called The Prince by Machiavelli. If you want to understand Russian politics, if you want to understand somebody like Vladimir Putin and others, it's important to read something like The Prince to understand, why people feel it's their responsibility to look out for their country the way that they do and the way that they do, right? Today in the West, we see such behavior as an aberration. But it's important to understand in a historical sense. But when Stalin died in, I think it was 52 or 53, you had Khrushchev, who in a clunky sort of a way ascended to the leadership. And there he is. And he had to prove himself, you know, being on the top of the hill of the Communist Party didn't mean that you were set forever, right? You wanted to get knocked, you were about to get knocked off the top by people who thought they were going to be better at it than you, that were more loyal than you, that resented you, that felt that you didn't deserve it. You know, the way that Stalin stayed on top, of course, was by his totalitarian nature. And, you know, he made sure that he got rid of all of his enemies. I mean, you look at somebody like Xi Jinping right now, and he's pretty much king for life, you see. But Nikita Khrushchev was a much more delicate figure in that regard, and he had to constantly make it seem to the world that the Soviet Union was not going to do things the way that Stalin did it, right? So he was a reformer, Khrushchev was, and it terrified all of the hardliners in the Soviet Union, right? Because if you allow some kind of freedom of press or something, not that that's happened under Khrushchev, but if you weren't as absolutist and crushing any kind of digression, then you were going to lose all. Right, and Khrushchev wanted to show the world that communism was a better system of government than capitalism was, right? And he wanted to market it. He wanted to bring it out into the open. He wanted to not be some kind of a dark kingdom like we see North Korea being today. Right, he wanted to show and convince and persuade the world in the post-World War II way that communism is something that people should aspire to. It's a better system of government. It's a better culture of morality, etc. And so he literally denounced Stalin's abuses, to use a term, and said that we are now going to be what the Soviet Union should have been all along, using the vehicle of communism, right? So he was a big reformer. He was also taking a tremendous chance, because if he blew it, he was going to get, you know, he was going to find out, he was going to wind up, as we say in Russia now, he was going to wind up disappeared, right? And so he wanted to end the Korean War. As did the new incoming American president, Dwight David Eisenhower. But this was Mikhail Gorbachev's model, right? I would venture to say that Vladimir Putin would not have Khrushchev as his role model. As a matter of fact, he didn't like Khrushchev. Vladimir Putin is more Stalin-esque. And but Khrushchev actually, Vladimir Putin blamed Khrushchev for creating, at least partially, the crisis in Ukraine, if that's what you want to call it, saying that Khrushchev unnecessarily gave the Crimea to Ukraine, right? Et cetera, et cetera. We can do a 6-part series on all of that someday. But my goal today is to show you what influenced Mikhail Gorbachev, which led to the eventual end of the Cold War. And Khrushchev was a part of that. There's Mikhail Gorbachev, right? So now he's, you know, a young administrator in the rising Communist Party, right? Notice the lack of birthmark. See it? They airbrushed it out, right? Because all of our guys got to be perfect, you see? There's his ID, See, once again, of course, with the airbrushed photograph. Well, I have no idea what that says, but now Gorbachev is in control now of he's like a regional governor, all right, and he is given this task of creating this project, which is going to be an irrigation canal, right, at a place called Stavropol. And this is where everybody sits back and they watch to see that as a potential person in charge, a person with authority in the Communist Party, how you're going to wield that authority, and if you're successful at it, right? Now, remember, it's not exactly a free market system here. So the question is, can you use the authority that you have in the communist system to do something that is going to be a project that's going to make the Soviet Union proud, right? And that includes making sure that there's no catastrophes happen, that there are no labor unrests, that if anything does come up that is probably it's politically quashed. You see, all of these things are very important in the Soviet Union in their quest for the illusion of a superior system. You see, you're not allowed to have any dirty laundry. And it turns out that Gorbachev does a very good job at it, okay? You know, we're not going to know whether or not this was the best canal or not, or if there are things that he should have done that he didn't do or otherwise, because success in the Communist Party meant that that nobody knows where the bodies are buried. Right. So this is the Gorbachev's regional leadership. This canal was completed, and the KGB is all over him now, as far as investigating him and sanitizing him and making sure that he's, you know, is he worthy? Now here's Mikhail Gorbachev, and he's visiting East Germany. This is in 1966. Now, it should be said about the Soviet satellite states. I mean, there were countries that were chafing at the communist bit. Probably the country that seemed to be least chomping at the communist bit was East Germany. East Germany kind of seemed to be sort of into it. You know, they had the Stasi, the secret police. You know, they were really the poster child of what a country inside the Soviet Union was supposed to be. Now, as a satellite state, East Germany, they had to put on a good show for whenever their parental person came down, right? So when a representative from the Soviet Union came down into one of these Soviet countries, then, you know, they took a tour and they wanted to make sure that everything was going well, and that everybody tried to fall over themselves, making them seem more communist than the next person. You know, it's a lot of sycophants, a lot of butt kissing, a lot of that sort of a thing. And there's Gorbachev taking a tour. I guess that's livestock in those cages, from the looks of it, now that I'm seeing it. 1966, right? Now, this is the same period of time, by the way, that you've got somebody like a Vladimir Putin who's coming up in the KGB, right? Time magazine, right? 1985. You see, now this is a big deal because, like I said to you before, the previous covers of Time magazine showing Soviet leaders, I mean, they were like these, you know, they were these ancient guys, right? Brezhnev, Chernenko, etc. And it was just going to be literally the old regime. And but here now, what made the difference is that here's somebody who's younger and therefore is going to have a different sensibility of things, presumably. And maybe he's going to have more contemporary ideas. And he's not going to be, like I said to you, he was inspired by Khrushchev, not Stalin. And so maybe this was going to actually be a new world order, you see? Now, I want to remind you, and I remember this as a child, you know, and some of you who are a little bit older than me might have more of an adult perspective on it. But geez, you know, this Cold War thing, I mean, it was like, it was everywhere all the time when I was a kid, right? It was, you know, it was in school, it was the siren, the air raid sirens on Friday morning, it was civil defense messages on the radio, right? It was even people building bomb shelters, it was fallout shelters, it was all of this stuff, right? And it was this seemingly intractable difference, you know, and we always had this, especially in the 1960s, 1970s, right? When I came of age as a young man. And it was, I don't know, it's like, wouldn't it be great if we all just got along, right? Wouldn't it be great if this whole thing was just over, you know? And, you know, another big influence in movies and all the rest of that. I mean, on television, I used to watch The Twilight Zone all the time. I mean, that was one of my favorite shows, right? And if you remember The Twilight Zone, and I'm sure you do, and it was always like this really apocalyptic stuff, you know, some guy comes crawling out of some basement, right? And there's nothing but rubble everywhere, and he's the only one still alive on Earth, and everything had this theme of nuclear annihilation to it. And here's this young guy over here, relatively young guy, and maybe somehow our youthful nature can speak to his youthful nature, and maybe we can break out of the old paradigm. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of hope, but with skepticism with the hope, right? Because maybe he looks younger, maybe he might seem younger, but he's probably just a chip off the old communist bloc. You see, that was the speculation here, and it was well deserved, frankly, right? Moscow's new boss, the cover says, younger, smoother, and probably formidable. And remember, back in these days, we didn't know what the hell was going on in the Soviet Union. We didn't know. All right. We didn't know what was going on in the Soviet Union. We still had Pravda and everything else like that. And the only things that they let out were either by accident or what the state-sponsored media allowed the Western world to hear or see. Now, do you remember this? Do you remember the Soviet Union in Afghanistan? Right, this is a long time ago already now, right? Right, 1986. So Mikhail Gorbachev's job on the world stage is to make their, I don't know, shall we call it a defeat in Afghanistan, look like it's not really that at all, you see? So now, you know, this is how you got to be a commensurate politician and turn something that's really sort of a debacle and make it say, no, 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 this is the way we planned it all along, right? And first stage of the Soviet troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, 1986, you know, so you have the Soviet troops marching out of Afghanistan, which, you know, we were rooting for them to get their heads handed to them, the Soviets, and that it was the Soviet Union's Vietnam, right? This intractable quagmire, right? That was just going to eat them alive, you know, and if you were a real communist hater, you relished every second of it, you see? There's a movie called Charlie Wilson's War. I wonder if you've seen it, with Tom Hanks. It's pretty well acted, and it has to do with specifically this period of time, you see, and how the United States actually was able to funnel all of these non-American weapons into the hands of the Afghanis, right? And then the Afghani, we trained them how to actually shoot down the Soviet helicopters and things. And it's one of the things that cost the Soviet Union so much attrition that they finally had to pull out. And that was the movie Charlie Wilson's War. Now, sadly, the people we trained, who were we came to be known as the Mujahideen, didn't really care that we were helping them. As far as they were concerned, as soon as they were done with the Soviets, they were going to throw us the hell out too, you see. And those people included somebody nobody ever heard of before called Osama bin Laden. And, so it's been a bit of a blindness, to see that when we thought that they were going to be appreciative that we helped them kick the Soviets out. And that wasn't really the case. We were just another large power that was treading on their, I don't know, their culture, their ideology, and they were happy to use whatever we gave them to literally turn right around on us. Charlie Wilson's War. So in April of 1983, Gorbachev gives a speech marking the birthday of Lenin, who was the founder of the Soviet Union, right? So in politics, and there are similarities in our own politics, which is a heretical thing to say, but I'm sorry to say that it's true. I mean, there are things you're allowed to say, and there are things that you're allowed to champion. And if you veer off the path of righteousness, then you're going to get, as we call it, canceled, That certainly was the case back here. And what they meant by canceled over here is that you would be disappeared. You would just be gone. Right. Even this is the Bolshevik Revolution was like the French Revolution, and the people who weren't pure enough they were used as useful idiots. And then after they secured power, then they went after everyone in their own inner circle and purged them too. You see, so you're not going anywhere in the Communist Party. You're not going to make it to the Politburo unless you praise the founding of the Soviet Union, right? Not to say that Gorbachev didn't mean it. He did mean it. He thought that communism was the real deal, that it was we just need to make changes like Khrushchev. We just need to modernize it. We need to be more persuasive. We need to be more open. There's nothing to be scared of, you see? So you have these people in the Soviet Union that are like, well, no, if we give an inch towards journalistic freedom, I mean, the whole house of cards is going to fall. And others are saying, no. Well, if this is really such a good thing, then what are we afraid of, you see? So, and here you can see the sarcasm in this, of course. If people don't like Marxism, they should blame the British Museum. See, so once again, the problem with Marxism / Bolshevism / communism / socialism, even, it isn't that it's a bad thing. It's just that it has been portrayed as a bad thing by the Western propagandists, right? So fast forward a little bit. 1985, right? And Gorbachev is, he becomes the person who is high up in the Communist Party now, right? And there's more of a modern photograph of him, 1985 in Geneva, right? And he's there, of course, at a negotiation, which I'll get into in a minute. Right now, this is the famous Iron Curtain. This is the most visible symbol of the Iron Curtain, right? The Berlin Wall, right? Gorbachev at the Brandenburg Gate during a visit to East Germany in April of 1986. So once again, Now he's in charge, and here he is, he's visiting, and bolstering East Germany, as it were. And they're there at this wall, which is always kind of ignominious thing. As politicians, you have to make something that is really up seem down, which is down seem up. And so, as we talked about before, the Berlin Wall invariably is something that is there to keep your own people in from fleeing. And how do you put a good spin on that, right? I mean, it's, embarrassing to start out with, at least from my perception. But for all of the people standing there, their perception is that they were protecting their territory from the degradation of the West, right? From the racial animus of the West. I mean, the Soviet Union used its own propaganda internally that was literally supplied by our own media, which, showed how you had racial inequality and prejudice going on in our country, and therefore, then we are not something to aspire to, you see. And in the Soviet Union, at least on paper, everybody was the same, because that was the whole point of socialist society, so that everybody could be completely equal in all things, right? And the point of the Communist Party to sell that was to say that if you go socialist, everybody will be equal. And look how in the West, you've got these rich people, and then you've got the poor people, and you've got the oppressed minorities, and then you have the white people, and it's just a sewer of inequality, you see. So if you go socialist, which is the purpose of communism, by the way, then that solves all of those problems, you see. So now here was another disaster that Gorbachev had to spin, right? It was another, we've got a modern world now. We've got helicopters flying around. It's not like we don't have drones or cell phones, no. But you may recognize what we're looking at here as a real disaster for Mikhail Gorbachev, the head of the Soviet Union, because this is the explosion of the reactor at Chernobyl, right? And this was always a touchstone. I have, maybe a closer beat on it, because I worked around the Navy for so long. I was in the maritime services for so long. And so, you had nuclear submarines of ours and nuclear ships of ours. And the only other nation back in those days that had these nuclear vessels were the Russians. And the Russian vessels, we were always touting ours to be superior to theirs, right? Because we had better workmanship, we had better designs, and better maintenance, and better training of the personnel, right? And that was something that the Russians never would, of course, admit to, because, they had to be better than us in all regards, you see. Now, even we've got 2 nuclear submarines sitting on the bottom of the ocean, and despite the fact that the ships are completely crushed, there's still no evidence of radioactive leakage, right? And which is just really, frankly, incredible after decades and decades and decades and decades. But that has to do with, the period of time that we were in the 1950s and the 1960s, and the influence of people like Admiral Rickover, who insisted on the absolute highest level of standards in naval and nuclear construction. Now, this over here you can't hide, right? Because it is something that is not on a ship. It didn't sink to the bottom. It is there. And it's not only that, but this radioactive plume, if you remember this, actually now, it goes into the atmosphere, and it gets to be shared with everybody else. You can't hide this. So it becomes this big mop-up operation from the standpoint of how is the Soviet Union going to handle this, right? Or are they going to take everybody who was in the entire town or that was involved with them, and they're going to send them to some gulag in Siberia so that they can never speak? They're going to make the whole thing go away, right? That's what everybody was expecting, because that's the way it always was. You know, but Mikhail Gorbachev, he wanted to make this seem as though he was in more of a modern country that was part of the world now, you know, and he didn't try to hide what happened in this disaster. So maybe things are going to be different, you know, and of course, I mean, if you know anything about this, it was just this fantastic explosion, you know. And when all of this saber rattling about nuclear weapons, whether they're little nuclear weapons or big nuclear weapons, even that we're tossing around today and all the rest of that, for me, it's like chilling. You know, I mean, once a battlefield is irradiated and this kind of energy is released, I mean, it's airborne, and it's too horrible to contemplate. You know, I was just reading a report. I've got to do a contemporary issues program tonight. I'm going to be talking about the fact that China is like building this massive nuclear arsenal. And it's just, part of me finds it hard to believe that we've looped around back to this the way we have, right? In the year almost 2023. It's depressing, frankly. So here's a quote from Gorbachev. "The accident at the Chernobyl nuclear plant has painfully affected the Soviet people and shocked the international community. For the first time, we confront the real force of nuclear energy out of control." You know, so he makes it a collective thing. You know, he says, look, this is a scourge for all of us. The United States had already had 3 Mile Island, you know, which wasn't quite the radiation leak that Chernobyl was, but it was enough to scare the hell out of everybody here in the States. You know, every contract that we had, every permit that we had for nuclear construction was basically frozen in 1979 from 3 Mile Island. And still today, even in our own discussions about energy sources and what is a safe source or not a safe source, I mean, nuclear is still being kicked around in the we're not sure category. Places like California, places like Germany are only keeping their power plants open because they literally have no choice at this point until, you know, so-called renewable energy is ready to the point where they can fuel everyone's needs. All right, at the 27th Communist Party Convention in February through March 1986, Gorbachev faced both hardliners who disliked his reforms and liberalizers like Boris Yeltsin, who thought they did not go far enough. So Gorbachev is in the proverbial rock and hard place, right? He's, for the people where in his modernization efforts of the Soviet Union, like Khrushchev before him, trying to make it seem more reasonable and to make it easier to be able to persuade the world that communism is a good thing and they should take that route for their own future. People felt as though he wasn't going far enough, Gorbachev, and people thought that he was going too far, right? If you liberalize further, then the country is going to be destroyed, right? But the inherent fault with this is that if you've got to have this, if you have to have censorship, doesn't that mean that what you're trying to say is so good must be flawed? Because if it wasn't flawed, then what's there to hide, you see? And you see some of the same threads running through certain aspects of our own civilization, our own society today, in the form of censorship, non-censorship, who's in charge of shutting things down, and from the standpoint of what, right? But you still had a lot of old timers here in 1986, people who remembered the old regime, where if you stepped out of line, you literally you were taken out back, and they taught you a lesson. The KGB, like, they locked you in the room and you were just gone, you see. And that's what they felt that they needed to do to keep their power, right? And as soon as you start to liberalize, as soon as you start to westernize, it's this slide to oblivion, you see. But Gorbachev really felt like Khrushchev did. Gorbachev really felt like the Soviet Union was the way to go. It was communism was a superior form, or at least an equal to form of government, than anything else that the world had to offer, you see. And he believed in it. He felt like the whole thing was strong enough to sustain. Right now, Ronald Reagan is president. And Ronald Reagan, which would be interesting to do a program on him, I suppose. Ronald Reagan, if you remember this, he started off as a staunch, I don't know, in today's terms, what we would call a progressive, okay? And he was in Hollywood, California, right? And, you remember that Hollywood got hit hard by the anti-communist McCarthy era sort of tactics, etc., right? And from that position, Reagan becomes a staunch anti-communist, right? So he starts off on the political left, and then actually by his own journey winds up having an understanding to himself about why it's bad and why you need to go in the opposite direction, right? So Ronald Reagan had the conviction of somebody who understood that which he was criticizing, right? And he becomes a staunch anti-communist. And he was looking for the opportunity to actually have the chance to not just be equal with communism, right? Not just as a competitor, or have something called détente, which is like, well, if they've got 20 nuclear weapons, then we should only have 20 nuclear weapons. Therefore, we have this equality and everything's in balance. Reagan looked at that over the number of administrations that preceded him, and he says, we're going to find a way to break their backs. We're going to find a way to win, not in military terms, but using military terms as a incentive / disincentive. We are going to break the back of the communists once and for all. And we are going to be done with this, as if it was a leftover thing from World War II. That in other words, the Cold War was this vestige of that still had to be dealt with, or we would never have any peace ever. And he was of the opinion, Reagan, why should we give away our superiority? Back in those days, this is pre-internet, pre-smartphone, pre-Apple, pre-Google, right? International corporations that don't necessarily see themselves as American. They see themselves as globalists, right? And Reagan had something that today would be referred to like as an America First policy, but back in his day, it was closer to what people had grown up with and seemed normal. You see, it wasn't an aberration to think, that you wanted to see America thrive and you want to see America actually survive over its enemies, right? So why have equality when you can actually have advantages, you see? And those advantages would actually put the pressure on the communists, you see. People saw that as a very destabilizing position, right? And always did, right? You have different people who turned out to be spies, who were selling secrets to the Soviets. And, you know, for the principled among them, that is, people who weren't just out for the money involved in selling secrets, they felt as though, the principled among them felt as though, well, it's destabilizing for the United States to have technology that the Russians don't have, you see, because if the United States feels as though it has an edge up technologically on the Soviet Union, then somebody in some position of power and leadership in the United States, some crazy general, right? And this is very Dr. Strangelove stuff, right? Or How I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Love the Bomb, right? That's literally what that movie is about, is that people in leadership positions in the military would feel as though we have this strategic advantage, why don't we use it and just kill all of them, right? So they were seen, as was Reagan was seen, as being crazy warmongers, and that they're going to create World War III and the annihilation of the earth as we know it, as a result of a nuclear exchange, right? So it was this thing where you have to just leave everything equal. If you don't automatically appease your enemy, then your enemy is going to think you're trying to hide something, and then that's going to create destabilization, right? So it was like the self-effacing policy. And Reagan was like, no, we have the power, we have the technology, we have the superiority, we should use it, right? Not necessarily to blow somebody up, but to use it even as a bluff, which is exactly what this turned out to be, right? Now, Gorbachev was in a tough spot. You see, the political situation during this time was that Gorbachev, because the world was indeed becoming a smaller place, people in the Soviet Union, they saw a pronounced version of the same tension that had existed even that caused the Berlin Wall to be built, right? Which is that the people in the West are prospering and they're not, right? And I don't know how much of it was propaganda or it wasn't, but I always remember seeing, like on TV when I was a kid, all of these, you know, people in the Soviet Union standing all on these lines to get like a loaf of bread or something like that, right? And we were all like, God, I'm glad that's not us, right? Or don't we have a better system? And that's terrible to have to live like that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So Gorbachev promised reforms to the people, right? He wanted his own people in a Russia first policy to be able to feel as though they were having a higher standard of living, right? And this is critical because you have to have the support of your own people for you to remain in power, right? It was the same sort of thing that Khrushchev had faced, right? Anybody who wasn't taking an iron fist policy like Stalin did, and I might argue that Vladimir Putin has, right? You have to win some level of internal popularity or you're going to lose your position of leadership, right? So Gorbachev had to prove to his own people that he was going to increase their quality of living. Now, like communist North Korea today, a majority of the money that Russia was spending was on its defense, right? They were spending all of this inordinate amount of money trying to keep up with us, and cost a fortune, right? So Gorbachev was hoping to thaw out relationships with the United States, so to the point where he, Gorbachev, can relax some of the new generation of defense spending and actually turn that money around towards reforms in his own country that would actually result in what was intended to be a higher quality of life for his own people, you see? So he opens these negotiations, or at least makes these suggestions that he wants to negotiate with the United States of America, and we're all for it, right? But now Ronald Reagan is not Jimmy Carter, you see? And he's got a different point of view about this. And Ronald Reagan says, you know what? I think we have these people, right? In 1983, Reagan announces his plans to develop and deploy a high-tech missile defense system based partially in space, right? Near space, specifically, in orbit. Reagan will use the SDI, which is the Strategic Defense Initiative. You remember this? They used to call it Star Wars, right? Reagan will use the Strategic Defense Initiative to scare the Soviets and ultimately to force the new Soviet premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, to negotiate. During the arms talks with Mikhail Gorbachev, Reagan will steadfastly refuse to stop research and development on the Star Wars system. This is a political bluff. The Star Wars was only in a conceptual phase. So in this successful propaganda effort, we still have enough control over the media ourselves. And, there's, like I said to you before, I mean, the 1980s was light years away from what it is right now. You see, as far as companies still feeling almost like in a post-World War II sense that they're American companies, that we're all in this together, that it's us versus them, right? And everybody kept their mouth shut. And Reagan was able to hold the lid on this notion that Star Wars was literally, we were going to launch the first rocket into space next week, and we're going to be able to literally shoot down Russian incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles with, like, I don't know, laser beam or some such thing. Okay. See, so the whole notion was that the Strategic Defense Initiative was going to completely destabilize the status quo. I mean, totally destabilize. I'm talking about kicking it over. The entire structure that kept things equal militarily between the Soviet Union and the United States was our détente. This sort of quasi-parity between them versus us. We don't have an advantage, they don't have an advantage, you see? So therefore, nobody's going to be stupid enough to try something with this advantage, you see? That's why it was stabilizing. And this literally kicked it over and said, nope, we got something essentially that's going to take your entire military force, right? You, the Russians. And so that means that every missile that you send over the North Pole with a nuclear warhead on it, we're going to zap it from space, and it's useless. Every submarine that you have that's going to launch a warhead from underwater against the United States, we're going to zap it from space, and it's going to be useless. In other words, your entire military is useless. Now, this is catastrophic, right? Gorbachev has to choose. If he actually takes all the money that Russia has, whatever money that is, and he's going to have to dump it now in its entire new generation of its own version of Strategic Defense Initiative, and it's going to bankrupt the country. And even if it doesn't bankrupt the country, what's going to happen is that all of those reforms that he already promised the people of Russia, I mean, that's not only is that not going to happen, but people's lifestyles are going to get even worse. It will be North Korea, you see? So Reagan puts Gorbachev in an untenable position. You either accept the United States as the superior power with this thing, and Gorbachev is saying, well, you guys, you can't do that, right? You have to stop research and development on the Strategic Defense Initiative immediately. And Reagan turns to him and says, who do you think you are? See, we're not doing that. And, and frankly, the whole thing was a gigantic bluff, because SDI didn't even exist. This is another picture of Gorbachev. So Gorbachev is the leader of a country that was the equal to the United States. And now all of a sudden it's threatened with like this kind of catastrophic irrelevance. You see, now, if you look at someone like a Vladimir Putin, right? What makes Vladimir Putin so angry about the events that occurred in the 20th century here is Vladimir Putin blames people like Mikhail Gorbachev, maybe him specifically, for having allowed the Soviet Union to actually fall because of this, you know? And it's the people like the Vladimir Putins of the world who are like, this, what happened to the Soviet Union at this juncture should have never happened. Now, God knows what would have happened if Vladimir Putin was the premier here instead of Mikhail Gorbachev at this particular juncture. He probably would have started a war. I'm not really sure, but there ain't no way he was going to allow the Soviet Union to fall from this position of prominence. Right now, Mikhail Gorbachev had no intention of doing so either. He didn't really understand the gravity of what was about to happen. You know, like many Soviet leaders since the end of World War II, you know, he was convinced that the people in the Soviet satellite states were actually happy to be communist states. Right? I mean, who wouldn't want to be a communist, you know? I mean, after all, it's the best thing there is. And they want to be a communist state. Now, as it turns out, many of those countries were coerced into it. You know, they were coerced into it by manipulative forces, political forces during and after World War II. The governments were flipped, and they were made communist states at, you know, the point of a gun, literally, in a micro sense and a macro sense. And then they were locked in there. You know, they were locked in behind the Iron Curtain. They weren't allowed to take Marshall Plan money. They weren't allowed to have any due influence from anything in the West, and the Soviet Union controlled them entirely, you see. Now, there are two terms that Gorbachev had here in his tenure as leader, and they were glasnost and perestroika, right? Which were two things that never even were considered to be uttered coming from a Soviet leader, right? Openness in government, right? And accountability, right? And freedom of the press, essentially, is what the three tenets of those two words mean. You see, so in other words, like Khrushchev before him, but even more so, Gorbachev was like, no, we're the Soviet Union, and we are so strong, and we are resilient, and we drove out the Nazi invaders, and look at the great triumphs that we've had, you see, and we have a great empire. And therefore we're not going to fall. We have some wiggle room here. And Gorbachev didn't realize that many of the people who were in these satellite countries, notably Poland, actually were itching at the bits to actually break the back of communism from within the Soviet Union. And here is another airbrushed picture. You know, everything here had to go through the censors big time. Gorbachev meeting with Romanian Marxist-Leninist leader Nikolai, I can't even pronounce that, forgive me. That's January of 1985, you know. So, but, you know, back in these days, I mean, there's no difference here than the Soviet Union as it was under Stalin's time, practically, as far as the closed nature of what you were allowed to portray, right? I mean, it had to go through the filter of Pravda. You were only allowed to say what is allowed to be said. You're only allowed to put forward a certain image, and that image always had to be one way. It could not be the truth. That's something that Gorbachev sought to change. He thought that it would soften the image of the Soviet Union and make it more acceptable to the world, and therefore, less threatening. Here's another one. Here's a picture of Gorbachev with Erich Honecker of East Germany, right? Gentlemen, see, he's got to appease the people in his own party that thinks he's giving away the store, right, by this glasnost thing, right, and the perestroika thing. Gentlemen, comrades, do not be concerned about all you hear about glasnost and perestroika and democracy in the coming years. These are primarily for outward consumption. There will be no significant internal change within the Soviet Union other than for cosmetic purposes. Our purpose is to disarm the Americans and let them fall asleep. So there you have it, right? I mean, if you want to look at, if we were to do some other program about modern China and how, I don't know, in 1972 that Nixon went over there, and when we're going to open this thing up, and well, in the next 30 years, China had 50% of our industrial capacity, and the whole idea from the West was that, well, as soon as we bring, the Chinese Communist Party and we open them to the global market, naturally, the communist Chinese state is just going to morph into a version of us, you see. But the thing is that the Chinese communist state actually was a bit of a Trojan horse, where they were allowing us to think that they were just going to become westernized. And once this openness was going to lull us into a sense of security, then they would just gain more and more and more power and never really change at all. You see, and this is something that here Mikhail Gorbachev is saying during his tenure, right? Do not be concerned about all you hear about glasnost, perestroika, and democracy. In other words, openness, honestness, accountability, freedom of the press. Don't worry about it, okay? These are primarily for outward consumption. In other words, us, the Western world. There will be no significant internal change within the Soviet Union other than for cosmetic purposes. Our purpose is to disarm the Americans and let them fall asleep. So these negotiations, these arms control negotiations, are going on, and Ronald Reagan and Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev at the summit in Geneva, Switzerland, October 18th, 1985. Right now, these two over here, they were having a rough time of it. And what they did was they went over by themselves and had their own little meeting without their entourages. And apparently they get along pretty damn well, right? But Reagan is not going to allow anybody bowl him over. He wants to have a good relationship with his adversary. Yet at the same time, he is going to look out for the interests of the United States primarily. And that is not going to change. At this particular moment, Gorbachev still thinks that he's the equal to the United States. And Reagan sees that he has this hand to play, which is the fact that strategic defense initiative doesn't really exist, but everybody thinks it exists. And he is going to use that as a lever, and he is going to bluff Gorbachev with it. President Reagan and Soviet General Secretary Gorbachev at the Hodfi House, if I'm pronouncing that right, during the Reykjavik summit in Iceland, October 12th, 1986. And it was at this one where Reagan famously walks out, right? And it is a sort of a one of these go-to moments where, you know, you want to show as a world leader since then that you're walking out on your opponent, because what he's telling you to do, you are not going to compromise the position of your nation or your nation's values or whatever it is. And therefore you're walking out, and it's kind of like a hell no, right? And Gorbachev, he decided that he was going to get tough with Reagan. And he was going to be like, you have to take strategic defense initiative off the table, or we're not talking about anything, right? And Gorbachev still thought that their countries were equal, and that if it was Jimmy Carter or somebody else, then you would have backed down. Don't forget now, there's another important position here that has to be seen in context of, right? And that context is that this is still in the 1980s, in 1986, is only 11 years after the United States tucked its tail and is out of Vietnam, out of what may be, you know, one of the more shameful episodes of American military operations, okay? You know, so we are in, from the 1975 to the 1985 period at least, okay, we are in this kind of like this sad sort of shame about what has happened, where, you know, these 63,000 American service people got sacrificed for what seems to be absolutely nothing. And we had such an American military, anti-Vietnam kind of stance in the years, and from the late 1960s onward, frankly, where it was, the military was at a tremendous low ebb as far as its idea of itself, its self-esteem, if you will, right? Its stature in American politics. You know, Vietnam was a tremendous shakeup of the assumed order that the military was the best we had in this country, right? Going right back, we had this undisputed notion that the military was a noble thing coming out of World War II, right? And to a significantly lesser degree from Korea, right? But and the Vietnam literally was the nadir of it after that. It went from one extreme to the next, you see? And this position of strength that Reagan had, it was attractive to people who were embarrassed from America's military fall, right? They wanted to see somebody in Reagan stand up unapologetically for the United States. And after this period of time where it seemed like the United States was in a position of, like, you know, moral and military decline. Yeah, and don't forget that in the mid-1970s also, through most of the 1970s, frankly, you had the Arab oil embargo, you know, and Jimmy Carter saying, you know, well, if you're cold, put on a sweater, you know, that sort of a thing. And the kind of notion that we were kowtowing to, you know, these kind of like Middle Eastern juntas was another thing that hurt people's pride of, like, I don't know, the World War II generation, etc. You see, so this is, you know, Reagan fit a specific purpose at a specific time that was very attractive to a lot of people. Of course, the people who hated him thought that he was going to start World War III, and the guy was like this wacky cowboy, You know what I mean? And he was a cowboy, of course, but it's kind of like, we need more intellectual, genteel people in there. This guy's going to get us nowhere, right? But anyway, Reagan walks out and he says, we're not giving up anything. I'm not taking SDI off the table. We're going to keep researching and development, and we're going to build the goddamn thing if we have to. And you're not really in a position, Mr. Gorbachev, to tell us otherwise. So go to hell. That's what happened. Now, from a standpoint of modernization, right, from a standpoint of world affairs and image, right, I mean, you see in Mikhail Gorbachev, for the first time in Soviet history, you see, I mean, what looks like, the equivalency of a Western type of a leader, you see? I mean, you never saw Stalin out on the town with his wife, right? You never saw like, I mean, Chernyenko and Brezhnev and all of those guys. I mean, these guys were our ivory tower people that were locked up, and you never saw them like this out in public. And you got Raisa on the right side there, and she's wearing a stylish, oh, this thunder, sorry. And she's wearing a stylish outfit. She looks Western, and this is a whole new thing. So in our imaginations, you can't help but ask yourself, I mean, geez, maybe this is the ushering in of a new era of world peace, where we're not going to be under this threat of nuclear annihilation or something like that. Whenever you have this kind of closeness, or at least it seems like closeness of a cultural understanding, then how is it possible that we're on the cusp of literally obliterating each other? This is Ronald and Nancy Reagan with Mikhail and Raisa Gorbachev attending a dinner at the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. in 1987. I saw the Reagans when at the Intrepid during an event in the early 1990s. The two of them were still together. And another thing that was very different about Mikhail Gorbachev was he actually, his number one confidant in all things was his wife, Raisa. Right, so she wasn't this person who was in the background someplace and nobody ever heard of or saw, or, I mean, he had her as his at his arm anytime he could, and he would confide in her things he could never confide in anybody. And she was a modern, intelligent, educated woman. Right, and that's something that was also very, very new. So the hope of it was that somehow this would also soften the, that kind of like that hard Soviet shell of who knows what's really going on back there, Gorbachev addressing the United Nations General Assembly in December 1988, where he announced, listen to this, deep unilateral cuts in Soviet military forces in Eastern Europe. So he does it, despite the fact that the United States has insisted that it is not going to stop research and development on Star Wars. Gorbachev, he rolls the dice in favor of not starting a new arms race, right? Which would have been bad enough as it would have had to do with the United States anyway, right? But the thing is now he is signaling to his own people and the world that he actually is going to take a chance and trust the United States, even though it means a power disparity. And he is going to signal to his own people simultaneously that I'm going to keep my promise, and we are going to increase the quality of life for the average Russian. Well, now for the hardliners in the Communist Party, this is just too much. I mean, it's like this guy he's got to come and he's got to stop the United States. And it's more important that the Soviet Union show that we're not going to back down and, you know, whatever it means. You see, so you see the position he's in. He sticks his neck way out here in his own country. And I mean, you know, I think that Gorbachev, I mean, he's not a perfect person who is, but he's kind of a peacemaker, you know. And as soon as Gorbachev does that, as soon as he signals, that's it, we're cutting back. We're cutting back. We can't afford it. We're not going to do it anymore. Right? You know, and the Soviet Union had to have their troops opposite our troops. On the other side of the Berlin Wall, they had to have their troops in Germany and other places in Europe. They had to have all of their missiles because we had missiles. Gorbachev is saying we're cutting way back. You see, now as soon as that happened, nobody waited a minute. I mean, this was one of the most startling things of all. It was like this pressure from inside the Soviet bloc countries. All of a sudden, they realized that the Soviet Union was not going to force compliance on this Cold War absolutism that had been the case for like the last 40 years, right? So immediately what happens now is this checkpoint Charlie, right? The famous checkpoint Charlie, right? Where if you go from point A to point B, you know, and it seems like you're sneaking over there, you're going to get shot. The East Germans are in a situation where East Germans are actually starting to migrate through the checkpoint, and they're sort of pushing it. And now the East German guards are like, what do we do? Are we enforcing this? Are we not enforcing it? And then as soon as the crowd sees that they're not really enforcing it because they're confused, because the East Germans don't know what to do, because they never had a situation like this before. The directives were always absolute from Moscow, you see, and then next thing you know, there's thousands of people crossing over from East Germany into West Germany. And the guards we're not enforcing it. Boom. And it was like having a crack in a dam. As soon as that happened, it was unstoppable. And this, as it was the most visible symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, so was it the most visible symbol of the end of the Cold War, to have the Berlin Wall crowded upon and then eventually beat and toppled. Thank you, Gorby. 1990. This is really something. And then Reagan is gone, and now you have Bush 41. Right? And there's big problems here now in the Soviet Union because people want his head, Gorbachev. You know, they are not happy. The Communist Party at its 28th Congress, February 1990. Now, this is a tremendous black eye to Lenin's Russia, right? To sort of see this military and influential parity to the United States and have the fall of the Berlin Wall, which can mean only one thing, that there's going to be this vacuum that's going to suck all of the people out from the former Soviet states, right? Because they're just, who would want to be under communism if you didn't have to, which was the opposite of what the communists always assumed or made the the propaganda element of it, that, well, of course they want to be communist states, you see? And now that they can actually come and go, the world will see that they were really held captive all of these years. But, you know, Gorbachev is a believer, you know, he's a believer, see, you know, and, you know, so here you go, more socialism means more democracy, openness and collectivism in everyday life, right? So he never let go of it, you know, he was convinced that the more socialist you go, the more democratic things will be, the more equality there will be, you see, you know, and this is now, the whole thing is sliding towards oblivion at this point. Meanwhile, the guy's a peacemaker. Like I said to you, October 15th, 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev is awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. Now, meanwhile, people are looking for his head, right? The people to the right of him are looking for his head. The people to the left of him are looking for his head, you know, and he has given away the Soviet Union. It's a travesty, or he hasn't gone far enough. 1991 coup against Gorbachev. It's a whole story. The guy goes on vacation and all communications are cut off. It's kind of like, you ever see the movie 7 Days in May, right? With Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas. It's kind of like that. I believe, as Lenin said, that this revolutionary chaos may yet crystallize into new forms of life, right? So basically, I don't know, every now and then, maybe a revolution isn't a bad thing. Gorbachev says he'll fight on, but he's a man without a country. Nobody wants him, right? There's no place for him left in the Soviet Union, right? He has given away the place. People hate him for it, right? And then the inevitable happens. Gorbachev lets the Soviet satellite states become free from the Soviet Union. And that moment is the demise of the Soviet Union. And now you have Russia, you have literally the independent states that were part of the Soviet Union, and it's not the Soviet Union anymore, you see. Leaders of the Soviet republics signed the Bolshevik Accords, which eliminates the USSR, and established the Commonwealth of Independent States in 1991. And that is the demise of the Soviet Union. And the fall of the Communist Party was right after. You know, I mean, it's almost simultaneously. It's unbelievable. Now, meanwhile, these two actually were friends, right? Reagan and Gorbachev. Look at these two ham bones, right? Rancho del Coelho, I tried to pronounce that right, 1992. So Reagan invites him out to, what was it, California, right? To the ranch, and there's Gorbachev and wearing his cowboy hat. And sadly, Gorbachev, his daughter Irina, and his wife's sister Ludmila at the funeral of Reza, 1999. She had cancer, leukemia, I think. And she passes away in 1999. Oh, look who we have here. See who's on the left? Vladimir Putin. Gorbachev at the inauguration of Vladimir Putin at the Grand Kremlin Palace, Moscow, May 2000. You see? Now, I'll bet you that if Putin had his chance, he would just shoot this guy right there. You know, I mean, Vladimir Putin, he is like a very Stalin-esque figure, Vladimir Putin. He is poker-faced. You don't know what the hell's going on with him. He takes all information in and doesn't give you anything, right? And we're literally in our own time right now. I mean, presently seeing some of the manifestations of what Vladimir Putin was frustrated about from the actions of one Mikhail Gorbachev right to this moment here in Ukraine. And going back to, frankly, Khrushchev too, right? And there's Vladimir Putin, who's basically installed himself as, you know, like Xi Jinping, like leader for life. There's Gorby at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, 1992. Gorbachev receives the first ever Ronald Reagan Freedom Award at the Reagan Library, May 1992. My life's work has been accomplished. I did all that I could. So that is the end of the Cold War as in its traditional sense of understanding the Cold War, which was between the Soviet Union and the forces that were working on behalf of the Soviet Union, or at least we thought were working on behalf of the Soviet Union. You see, all of that time, in 1991, that was essentially the end of it. And it created a new era, right? We had immediately this thing called peace dividend. And so we were like, well, who the hell is there left to fight? You know, I mean, we got rid of the Imperial Japan, we got rid of the Nazis, and now the communists are gone. You know, and even though it's already modern times with China, everybody was convinced that I mean, look what happened to the Soviet Union. I mean, China's not going to pose a problem for anybody. They're going to go the same way that Russia went, you see? And so that's why there was all of this leniency towards communist China, because we had gained the sense that, you know, we would have the ultimate triumph over communism. I mean, after all, the best example possible was the fall of the Soviet Union. It's only a matter of time, once exposed to Westernism, then the Communist Party in China will fall in the same fashion. But we never really appreciated that Maoist communism was much, much different than Leninist communism. And certainly in the communism light form that was portrayed by one Khrushchev, and then especially by Mikhail Gorbachev, you know. Well, what do you know? That's the end of it. So there we go. It's 3:29, and I just wanted to put a cap on that. So I hope that you enjoyed our program. And like I said to you, my idea with this is to kind of give people a general understanding of like, oh, so that's the progression of events that happened. And that's why that makes sense. Hopefully that's what I was able to convey with you. Kind of tell this in a series of stories instead of just a bunch of like facts stacked up on top of each other. All right, I'm looking forward to doing more programs with you. Please keep tuned for what's coming up next. And I want to thank, as was thanked before, our sponsors for this. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do it. And so thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Art, for everything that you do. Thank you so much for your time as well. Like Art was saying, you know, thanking the sponsors, the Friends of the Library. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do this program. And for right now, that is the end of our sessions. We will be taking a break for the holiday season, but please keep an eye out for next year for more series by Art that will be offered here at the library. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful holiday and a happy new year.
Bye-bye. God bless.